debt, an issue that the entire world has experienced. Debt is not only experienced by individuals, but also by entities and governments. It is an essential element of society so that the world and investments can continue taking place. It is a necessary element of the current economic cycle. Without debt, there are no investments, and without investments, there's no job creation and no activity. But anything to an extreme is bad. When a country owes too much money, it puts pressure and doubts on creditors if the debt can be paid off. Cases such as Greece, Italy, or even Venezuela are examples of this. There are several ways to calculate the debt of a country. If it comes from the state or from companies, one of the most used is to calculate the national debt with respect to the GDP, which is simply the total debt divided by the gross domestic product. So, if your debt exceeds your GDP, you could say that you have reached a point where you owe more than you produce. And believe it or not, there are many countries in this situation. Some indicate that the United States is the most indebted country in the world, but as long as the country has the ability to pay, the debt will not be a risk. Today, we will use this measure to determine the most indebted countries with respect to their GDP. Let's begin. Number 10. Portugal. Portugal has a GDP of $217 billion, which makes it one of the smallest economies of the European Union. Belgium doubles this in GDP, having practically the same population of 10 million people. Thus, Portugal has a debt equivalent to 117% of its GDP, making it the third most indebted nation in the EU. Portugal, a country with less access to credit historically, being part of the Eurozone is an opportunity to borrow large amounts of money at a very low interest rate. Even so, despite its great debt, in recent years, the government of Portugal has made financial adjustments trying to avoid austerity measures. The plan has worked well, since the Portuguese economy grew by 2.8% in the previous year, the largest annual growth in the last 20 years, surpassing the growth of even France or England. Number 9. Cape Verde. Cape Verde is a small African island state, which mainly lives on tourism from other parts of the continent and the world. Cape Verde is considered to be one of the most stable countries in Africa due to its post-colonial transition to a democratic governance, high literacy rates, health indicators, and government transparency. However, the country has experienced relatively modest growth in recent years, especially due to a decline in tourism affected by the global economic crisis. Faced with declining revenues, the government struggles to keep its debt under control. Thus, the public debt has now increased, representing 127% of their GDP. Budget deficits have increased each year as the government has tried to make investments to diversify the economy, which is largely dependent on tourism. Therefore, Cape Verde has a GDP of only $1.75 billion but owes more than $2 billion. Number 8. Barbados. Barbados, such as Cape Verde, is an island state located in the middle of the Caribbean. It is an economy highly dependent on tourism. They heavily depend on tourism from Latin America, Europe, and the US. Barbados is still a slightly more developed economy compared to some Latin American countries with a GDP per capita of $17,000. Thus, the GDP of Barbados is estimated at $4.7 billion and its national debt is estimated at more than $6 billion, equivalent to 128% of their GDP. So authorities are developing an economic reform plan designed to face these challenges. But as is the case with many islands around the world with limited resources, they never get out of their spiraling debt and must often depend on international bodies to continue financing the state. Number 7. Eritrea. Eritrea is a rapidly growing country with a population growth rate of 3.3% and a fertility rate of 4.37 births per woman. Since 1960, life expectancy has increased from 39 to 60, while infant mortality rates have declined significantly. This is helping Eritrea grow, even though the country faces serious health problems and low living standards for many of its inhabitants. The economy of Eritrea has been growing year after year. The GDP is estimated at $2.6 billion in 2011, but its debt represents more than 128% of the national GDP. Despite recent growth, Eritrea remains one of the least developed countries in the world. The evidence indicates that poverty is still widespread in the country, where 65% of the population lives in rural areas and 80% depends on subsistence agriculture for their sustenance. Eritrea has a GDP per capita of just $506, $250 less than Haiti, the poorest country in America. Number 6. Italy. Here we find the third largest economy in the Eurozone, behind Germany and France. In addition to being the 8th world economy, Italy is a highly developed country with a powerful and flourishing industry, but it has always been submerged under multiple political crises and has had so many governments that I have lost count, but surely there have been more than 50 since the return of democracy. Like Portugal and Greece, Italy went into debt as if there was no tomorrow. Today, Italy is currently in a recession and led under an anti-system government and clearly anti-European, which has not facilitated at all the cooperation between Berlin, Paris, and Rome. Italy has a GDP of $2 trillion, and its debt with respect to GDP represents the 129% of the Italian GDP, which would be $2.5 trillion, the equivalent of the GDP of France. Number 5. Lebanon. For the last few years, Lebanon has become the most indebted economy in the Middle East. Political and economic factors have also contributed to this fact. Lebanon barely had 5 million people and was overwhelmed by having to receive an estimated 1 to 2 million refugees from Syria. The enormous economic and social weight that the refugees implied also caused fiscal and social problems. The economy of Lebanon depends on tourism, construction, and finance for growth. The three are the pillars of the Lebanese economy. But the country is plunging into a crisis of property and perhaps into a banking crisis that will threaten its currency. An economic crisis could destabilize a country already flooded with refugees and plagued by sectarian divisions. The problems in the banking sector, which attracts investors from across the region, could be felt beyond the borders of Lebanon. Lebanon has an estimated $51 billion, and its debt to GDP is estimated to be at 160% of the GDP. Number 4. Venezuela. Venezuela is currently experiencing an economic, social, and humanitarian cataclysm at the hands of Nicolas Maduro's dictatorship. The regime's disastrous actions, together with international sanctions, have caused the diaspora of more than 4 million people from the country, overpassing the Syrian refugee crisis without a civil war. Venezuela owes more than $60 billion to China and more than $15 billion to Russia, its two main creditors. Venezuela's debts remain intact and increasing, while in fact the economy and the GDP plummets. In the last 5 years, the Venezuelan GDP has been reduced by 50%. The last official figure of Venezuela was in 2014, when the country had a GDP of $480 billion. But now we can assume that it is at around $230 to $250 billion. Obviously, as GDP plummets and debts remain, the percentage of debt with respect to its GDP does not stop increasing. Venezuela 5 years ago was not among the most 30 indebted countries. Today, its debt stands at 170% of its GDP, and it is very likely that Venezuela will never pay them. According to this trend, if Venezuela's GDP continues to plummet at the current rate, Venezuela could surpass 300% of debt with respect to its GDP by the end of 2020, becoming the most indebted country in the world. Number 3. Sudan. Sudan recently experienced an inflation of more than 60%, and its currency is only worth 2 US cents. An intermittent shortage of fuel and food and the scrapping of bread subsidies in January had caused tens of thousands of people to protest in the streets. The economy had been deprived of currency since South Sudan split in 2011, taking most of the country's oil, which was once one of the most important exports of Sudan. Although gold mining has grown since then, officials recognize that the most precious metal is smuggled out of the country. In December, the International Monetary Fund said central bank reserves were at around $1.1 billion, or just enough for 7 weeks of import, about half of the 3 months generally considered etiquette. The country is in a constant state of stagnation, despite the help from the international community. The GDP of Sudan is estimated to be at around $100 billion, and its debt with respect to its GDP exceeds 176% of the economy. Number 2. Greece. The case of Greece is very well known, since in 2012, the country was about to leave the Eurozone if a rescue plan was not approved that would allow the country to obtain a financial bailout of gigantic proportions. Greece received 3 disbursements of more than $300 billion, but at a strong social cost. Harsh austerity measures caused more than 500,000 Greeks to leave the country, and unemployment will reach more than a quarter of its population. Most of the blame has been the different Greek governments over the years that took advantage of the fact that Greece was in the Eurozone to access a large number of low-interest loans. The Greek economy basically worked by getting debt to pay off their debt. In 2008, the GDP of Greece was at around $350 billion, and just a decade later, it is now $200 billion. The country became 25% poorer, losing a quarter of its GDP. And by losing more than a quarter of its economy, Greek debt is the highest in the Western Hemisphere, standing at almost double its GDP. Number 1. Japan. The case of Japan is very interesting because so far in the video, we have mostly seen underdeveloped countries or countries such as Italy or Greece that lived thanks to the debt, and even the case of Venezuela. But Japan is different. This country is the most indebted in the world with respect to its GDP. Its debt reaches more than 220% of its gross domestic product, totaling more than $10 trillion. For reference, this is the equivalent to 4 times the entire GDP of the entire continent of Africa. So how is it possible that Japan owes so much? It's a complicated and very long story. It is the product of several financial, stock market, and real estate crises. Especially as a result of the 90s, Japan has been struggling with low growth rates and with the constant price fall, known as deflation. These phenomena are not new, but their repercussions on society have caused the Japanese and companies to prefer to consume and borrow less, which explains that in fact, the Japanese debt of the private sector, i.e. companies, represent no more than 120% of its GDP. The exorbitant debt of Japan, that exceeds 2 times its own GDP, comes from the Japanese government that has tried at all costs to inject money into society, to relaunch the economy and investment. These are the current plans of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and they are still waiting to see results, but they can only be realized in the long term. The Japanese crisis of debt and deflation must be dedicated in another video, but for the moment, you can check out my other video that talks about the demographic crisis in Japan, which explains that statistically, Japan could be left without a population in 1,000 years. So I hope you liked this video, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. You can also check out our Spanish and French channels in the links in the description below. See you next time.